Ladies and gentlemen, the Kauffman Foundation's 4th annual State of Entrepreneurship program is beginning. Please welcome Senator Jerry Moran from Kansas, who has been a major leader in the Senate in financing legislation to help startups.
Good afternoon to our guests. Welcome to Washington, D.C., and delighted to be here to help kick off what I think is a very important topic with very significant people who are involved in startups and entrepreneurships. This is the opportunity to kick off the 4th annual Entrepreneurship Address and introduce to you all the President and CEO of the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, Tom McDonnell. Those of us from Kansas, I assume it's true for the people from Missouri, have great pride in the fact that the Kauffman Foundation is headquartered in Kansas City, and it's one of the largest foundations in the world dedicated to the promotion of entrepreneurship. Their research shows what most of you know to be true. When entrepreneurs succeed, our communities and our nation succeeds. For the last 3 decades, entrepreneurs and their young companies have been responsible for nearly all of the net job creation in our economy, creating an average of 3 million jobs each year. Yet, the state of entrepreneurship in America is not as strong as it once was. I had someone in my office recently who told me that the American dream is alive and well around the world. They know what the American dream is, but it's being lived someplace else. We need to make certain that the American dream is lived in America. Fewer entrepreneurs are starting businesses, and those who do are hiring fewer workers. The United States faces stiff competition from abroad. And during the short time that I've been a member of the United States Senate, I'm just beginning my 3rd year, at least 7 other countries have taken serious action to better support and attract entrepreneurs to their countries. Working closely with the Kauffman Foundation, I authored legislation to reverse these trends and to jumpstart our economy through a heavy dose of entrepreneurship. I got interested in this when I saw there was little appetite by Republicans and Democrats, by White House and Congress, to do anything about the mounting national debt. And if it's so difficult to figure out what tax policy and spending policy ought to be, and we can't walk away from those issues, but in the absence of resolution of those issues, maybe we can find a way to grow the economy and help pay down the national debt, and in the process put Americans to work. And so a bipartisan group of senators joined me in that effort, and we introduced last year Startup 2.0. An identical bill was introduced in a bipartisan manner in the House of Representatives. This legislation, Startup 2.0, makes changes to the federal regulatory process to lessen government burdens on job creators. It modifies the tax code to encourage investment in new businesses. It accelerates commercialization of university research that can lead to new ventures, and most importantly, provides new opportunities for highly educated and entrepreneurial immigrants to stay in the United States, where their talent and new ideas can fuel economic growth and create American jobs. There's a lot of talk right now in Washington about immigration reform, and as this discussion continues, I believe it's imperative for Congress to provide a way for immigrants to stay in the United States and grow their businesses. Startup Act 2.0 does that. While these policy changes may seem just common sense, Congress is yet to move forward on them. Without congressional action, we risk losing the next generation of great entrepreneurs, and the jobs that they will create will be created elsewhere. The Kauffman Foundation has been an invaluable ally in these efforts to promote entrepreneurship in our nation's capital. Their research has supplied the data needed to make the case for entrepreneurship, and their policy prescriptions have spurred legislative activity. Now leading this great foundation is Tom McDonnell. Before assuming the helm at the Kauffman, just this year, Tom served on the Foundation's Board of Trustees, including service as its chairman. And previously, he served as president and CEO of DST Systems, a role he held for 40 years. Headquartered in Kansas City, DST is a publicly traded company that employs more than 11,000 associates, both domestically and internationally. Today's event on the state of entrepreneurship comes at a critical time. Entrepreneurs are the lifeblood of our economy, and I'm convinced that unless we unleash the power of entrepreneurship, we cannot return to prosperity. Please join me in welcoming Mr. McDonnell, who will share Kauffman Foundation's latest research on financing entrepreneurial growth.
Well, I want to thank the Senator for that introduction, and it's clear from his remarks that in his position, he clearly understands the role that entrepreneurship, evolving new startup businesses and so forth play in our economy, and it's extremely important to have that kind of representation in Congress. And I thank you, Senator, for joining us today. I also want to recognize, by the way, our Minister Karen Mills of the U.S. Small Business Association, who will be following me in remarks. I'm making the transition from a long-term association in a for-profit enterprise that I would like to think had some entrepreneurial characteristics of its own. So you'll have to bear with me as part of that transition. Historically, because I grew up with a business for 40 years, I very seldom use prepared remarks. But in order to keep me within reasonable bounds, both as to time-wise and to topic, I have some here today, so I will see if I can't work through that. But I've already deviated somewhat. I'm sure I can see a little bit of the angst there, but I just can't pass up the opportunity to make one other introduction, and I really don't know her name, but there's a lovely young lady at the second table in front of me who I'm sure is the youngest budding entrepreneur we have here today. So welcome you also. If you haven't seen her, she's really cute, and she's right over here. The report that Kauffman has just recently issued really relates to how do we finance and therefore foster entrepreneurial growth. Our founder, Ewan Marion Kauffman, really set a direction that causes us to try to understand and promote entrepreneurship. He felt, as we do also, that entrepreneurs are critical to the strength and dynamism of our economy. And he really saw both entrepreneurial activities and educational activities positioning people to be legitimate members of society, be able to provide not only their own livelihood, but in the case of entrepreneurs, maybe opportunities for the livelihood of others. So given this focus, this past summer, we brought together a group of scholars, policymakers, practitioners, and thinkers to discuss what role does finance play in the creation and growth of entrepreneurial companies. The group covered a wide range of subjects. We identified, as you would expect, a number of problems and made a series of recommendations for how to address those. The report that you have at your table spells out the key issues covered by our distinguished group. And I'll talk about some of their recommendations. But before doing so, I want to give you just a little brief background on what we consider to be the nationwide state of entrepreneurship. The positive side is the emergence of a national consensus that encouraging entrepreneurship can help revive our sluggish economy. Every area of the country, or nearly every area, has invested resources in promoting entrepreneurship, introducing a lot of programs both for training and supporting and helping entrepreneurs. That support for entrepreneurs spans the political spectrum. 2 years ago, the White House launched an initiative focused on startups, and President Obama remarked at that time that entrepreneurs, quote, play a critical role in expanding our economy and creating jobs. However, this good news is offset by a national decline in entrepreneurial activity that's unfolded over the past several years. Business creation dropped very sharply from 2008 to 10, and it really hasn't returned to those pre-recession levels. The rate of American entrepreneurship began dropping even before the Great Recession, and the rate of job creation from new businesses fell significantly during this period. The decreases have not been uniform. Some areas of the country fret over the latest startup bubble, and others are desperate kind of for some entrepreneurial rebirth. We've also seen new and young companies continue to face significant hurdles as they seek capital. Bank financing really has not yet recovered from the recession, and there's a great deal of uncertainty over the long-term effects of Dodd-Frank. In the public markets, we've had a decade-long sort of drought of initial public offerings, and it's raised concerns that the American system for building innovative and sustainable companies is broken to some degree. So this challenging environment, it's had at least one benefit, and it's really helped spark tremendous innovation in entrepreneurial finance, particularly in the early stages of business creation. And these innovations have the potential to unleash higher levels of entrepreneurship. In order for these financing innovations to pay dividends, however, there'll need to be a variety of regulatory reforms, particularly related to the country's capital market, both on the debt and the equity side. Our Kauffman report that you have in front of you addresses these reforms, and I'll touch on three of them in particular. One of the most popular and successful financing developments over the past few years has been known as crowdfunding. It enables individuals and teams to raise money over the internet from dozens or thousands of sources of small amounts. There are now an estimated 200 crowdfunding sites in the United States, and globally, the crowdfunding platforms, comes out of the cloud also, that's where the internet works, raised $1.5 billion in 2011, and it actually, that $1.5 billion came from 1 million independent crowdfunding campaigns. Most of that was raised in North America. Last year's passage of the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Jobs Act marked a significant step towards changing the regulatory environment for entrepreneurial finance. And it included provisions for equity crowdfunding. The regulations to carry this out, however, are still pending. As a foundation, we would urge the Securities and Exchange Commission to balance innovation with precaution in outlining these regulations. The spirit of the Jobs Act was to encourage innovation and to expand the experimental platform of crowdfunding. And its successes or failures should be determined in the marketplace, not by the regulators' offices. A related issue is access to capital for startups. Media coverage of entrepreneurs often focuses on those who take venture capital. However, debt is a far more widely used source of initial funding for new companies. This debt often takes the form of personal loans to the founder, personal credit card financing, business credit card financing, and lines of credit. Bank loans are important as well, but bank lending to small businesses declined by $100 billion from 2008 to 2011. In 2012, less than 1/3 of small businesses reported actually having been able to acquire a bank loan. We're not calling for banks to be required to make more loans to small businesses, but we would like to see the federal government collect better data about bank lending. If you have good policy, it cannot be made on the basis of incomplete information, and public policy actions aimed at addressing difficulties in the small business lending market need to be better informed. To that end, we're recommending that the Federal Reserve reinstate and ideally annualize the survey of small business finances, which was an important data source for firms' demand for lending before it was terminating following the report that was issued in 2003. Along the same lines, various agencies of the federal government should improve data collection so that we can better understand the trends in financing. The final issue I'll touch on is venture capital. While the shares of company that have access to venture capital, actually it's relatively minuscule, about 0.1% of the companies. Venture capital matters because it is also a disproportionate funder of firms that eventually go public, therefore larger, high-growth firms. Venture capital-backed firms account for between 5% and 7% of U.S. employment, so it's important to get venture capital right. The task force identified some changes that limited partners can press to make venture capital even more effective. First, find ways to encourage greater transparency in the metrics used in evaluating venture capital, but without, in effect, creating the opposite result in the way of perverse incentives. The commonly used metric for gauging venture capital performance is the initial rate of return. And while that's useful, there could be benefits in supplementing this with a comparison against public market returns to really determine which is the most efficient financing mechanism over a period of time. Also, it's worth rethinking the prevailing fee structure in venture capital. The current incentives would appear to drive short-term behavior rather than long-term value creation. If you move to longer periods of fee computation, say for instance 3 years, rather than a fixed percentage of assets under management, something like that might be considered. So that in effect the incentive is not to create a company that can be monetized as rapidly as possible, but create a company that has enduring economic value and what that brings to society as a whole. There are many more recommendations contained in the report, which I hope you will all have the opportunity to read in some depth. The individual recommendations may seem modest in scope, but collectively they could reinvigorate, through the use of financial tools available to new businesses, growth, and they could serve as a catalyst for a new era of entrepreneurship in the U.S. And, you know, we're fortunate to have with us today individuals who have helped craft the recommendations and who are actually in many cases on the front lines of financing entrepreneurs. Following Administrator Mills, this group will be participating in hopefully a stimulating panel led by Bob Lighton, who now with Bloomberg but has a long history with the Kauffman Foundation and certainly significant contributions to this whole area of research and activity. So I look forward to hearing from them, and if at this point you would please join me in welcoming Administrator Mills.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for that great introduction. And I really want to thank the Kauffman Foundation for inviting me to be here today, and to congratulate Tom for taking the helm of this absolutely extraordinary institution. You know, this is this event today, looking at it, you can see why leaders in government and throughout business turn to Kauffman as the place for expertise, best practices, wise counsel on research as relating to entrepreneurs. And I also want to thank Senator Moran for all of his support for entrepreneurs and for the SBA in his Senate role. So entrepreneurship, as Tom mentioned, is what drives growth in our economy. And we know that it creates jobs. You've got some of the data. We know that it fuels innovation, and we know that it makes us more globally competitive. In fact, it's America's secret sauce. And what I want to focus on today is how we expand the entrepreneurial playing field, how we make it more inclusive, so that we can capitalize on all of the entrepreneurs who are all across America and bring to fruition what they have to offer. I travel every week. I think I'm up to 40 states, and I meet terrific entrepreneurs everywhere I go. So in Nashville, in Ames, Iowa, in Manchester, New Hampshire, many of these entrepreneurs are doing everything right. But because of their geography or because of market gaps, their businesses aren't getting the counseling, the expert networks, or the capital that they need to scale their operations and take them to the next level. In fact, as many of you know, and it may say in that report, today nearly 70% of venture capital goes to just 3 states, and you can all name them: California, Massachusetts, New York. but across the United States, and our goal at the SBA is to make sure that there is access and opportunity in all the rest of the regions, and so that we can get the transformative benefits of entrepreneurship into more communities and more industries. When I came first to the SBA 4 years ago, small businesses and entrepreneurs were getting crushed. They were in the middle of the worst economic recession in decades, and the banking market, which is one of the primary sources of financing for small business, had frozen. So to help them, we stepped in at the SBA. And in the Recovery Act, we raised our guarantees to 90%, and we reduced and eliminated our fees. And it worked. We were able to absolutely reverse the down, get the hockey stick going up, and we brought more than 1,000 community banks back to SBA lending. And one of the other things we did that's very important is we simplified and streamlined the processes. We took over 100 pages of paperwork out of some of our loan products. This is something that the President has been hammering on, and we want to simplify and streamline things for small businesses. And this worked also. We just finished 2 record years at the SBA of $30 billion each into the hands of small businesses. But there are still gaps. And we are continuing to particularly work on small dollar loans. So today, when I talk to business owners, we're having a very different conversation, though, than we were 4 years ago. We're talking about expansion. We're talking about the most effective ways to scale their operations and to reach new markets. How do we build on this momentum? How do we make America's entrepreneurs the cornerstone of our economic growth plans? So for starters, we know that all small businesses are not the same. And at the SBA, we worry about all 28 million of the small businesses, but only 6 million of them actually have employees. And the Main Street small businesses that are part of the fabric of our community, they're very important to the SBA. And as I just described, many of the SBA's loan and counseling operations are focused on ensuring their success. But the real drivers of growth, particularly in job creation, are a much smaller set of high-growth startups that punch above their weight. And economic research shows that employment at these startups account for just 3% of the workforce, but the hiring by these firms represents 20% of net new job creation. In Washington today, as you are well aware, much of the discussion around job creation and American competitiveness is being dominated by important conversations about large macro issues. So this is tax policy, the deficit, the federal budget. And addressing these issues is critical. But what I want to talk about today, and what is missing from some of these conversations, is a focus on the microeconomic issues. By that, we mean, how do we create the ecosystems where small businesses and entrepreneurs can create that next new job and bring that next new innovation to market? A successful entrepreneurial ecosystem brings together university research, skills training, and providers of capital so that they're accessible to communities all across the country. Let me briefly talk about 3 strategies that we are pursuing at the federal level to drive these ecosystems. And the first strategy, I know many of you in this room are also active in, they are a series of place-based strategies, particularly clusters and accelerators. For every region of the country, there is a set of economic assets. So there's the healthcare community in Nashville, the cybersecurity community in San Diego, food processing in upstate New York, and I asked for one in Kansas City, I got back animal health and nutrition, right? When small businesses cluster, they can draw on regional assets like universities or local industries. It drives job creation, new business formation, innovation, and new products. In a speech about clusters, President Obama noted that the synergies that develop from bringing all of those facets together can make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So starting in 2010, the SBA led an administration-wide effort around clusters. And I'm pleased to say that so far we have invested across the federal government in over 50 clusters, and over 15 agencies have participated. We track these things, and we have very, very strong early results. The second place-based activity is accelerators. And accelerators are related. I call them first cousins to clusters, but they're not exactly the same because accelerators are focused on accelerating startups. And they're in some ways the evolution of incubators where small companies have a place to start. They have a support network, which includes counseling and access to capital. And new accelerators of all varieties are springing up all across the country. Over the last year, we decided to use our role at the SBA as the grand convener. So we brought together over 100 accelerators, first in regional convenings, and then we had a large group to the White House last fall to discuss best practices and the formation of a national network. So we're going to continue to work on this accelerator network with the Kauffman Foundation, who was actually one of the original forces in identifying and supporting these groups. Now, the second focus at the federal level I'm going to talk about might be kind of unexpected, but it's supply chains. And we are focused on building effective supply chains of small and medium-sized businesses and innovative businesses here in the U.S. There are an estimated 250 to 700,000 firms who participate in the supply chains of the U.S. government, particularly the Department of Defense, and commercial supply chains like GE and Boeing and the U.S. automotive companies. And we know that having an effective supply chain of small firms is critical to the competitiveness of large corporations. And what we've seen is that when they have a strong and nimble and particularly innovative supply chain, that can drive decisions by large companies to insource production back to the United States. So the SBA is leading an integrated administration-wide effort to strengthen America's supply chains and make them more efficient and continue to make them more innovative and more incorporate more entrepreneurs. We're going to assemble companies and their suppliers from across the country. We're matching them with resources they might need, like working capital, advice and counseling on manufacturing, and access to export opportunities. The first meeting in this supplier initiative is going to be hosted by IBM later this month. Last point, growth capital. The third element of SBA's support for entrepreneurs really centers around the subject of this report from Kauffman today: where do they find capital? And we know that high-growth companies face big gaps in terms of access to growth capital and to early-stage investment. Tom mentioned a few of the things that the report focuses on, some new tools that we have supported, including crowdfunding, that was included in the Jobs Act, will help fill those gaps. But in addition, at the SBA, we have both our $100 billion loan portfolio, which is important capital, but we have one of the most important tools, our Small Business Investment Company program, SBIC. And through this program, we actually allocate $3 billion a year in authority to funds who then deploy the capital to high-growth entrepreneurs. Over the past 5 years, we've completely streamlined this program. When I came in, we were doing about $600 million a year through this program. It took 15 months to get a license. Now we're doing almost $3 billion a year, and it takes 5 months to get a license. And the program really operates today as, in some ways, a model public-private partnership with expert decision-making happening from the private sector experts, and they are deploying the capital to promising firms all across the country. We had our third record-breaking year in this program in fiscal 12, and we've used it to launch new platforms for early-stage investing and for increasing the deployment of this kind of capital to high-growth companies in economically disadvantaged regions of the country. Let me close with a quick story. I was recently in Ames, Iowa. Been there? It's nice, actually. Yeah. And I was visiting a company called Harris Vaccines. So what are they doing in Ames, Iowa? They are making a leading vaccine for shrimp, and they're exporting to Indonesia. So what is a company in Ames, Iowa doing? Making shrimp vaccine. Well, it turns out, of course, that a professor at Iowa State developed a breakthrough regarding the swine flu. And one of our small business innovation research grants actually took that technology and expanded it to shrimp. So now Dr. Hank Harris and his team are out there exporting and growing one of the most innovative businesses in a rural area of America and providing world-class solutions and American jobs in the process. That's a testament to inclusive entrepreneurship. What we need to do is to make sure that more companies like this have the wind at their back. At the SBA and all across the administration, our job is to provide access and opportunity so that these high-growth entrepreneurs can do what they do best, grow their company and create jobs. That's how we create an American economy that can grow and can compete all across the globe. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Administrator Mills. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your lunch.